Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's show, Energy versus Climate revisits what it means to build back better, live at the Calgary Climate Symposium. It's been more than 6 months since we last checked in on our energy crystal balls, and a lot has happened. The price of crude oil has bounced back. We have a new U.S. president with a $2 trillion climate plan. Canada has a new climate plan with an eye-grabbing carbon price schedule. With the Supreme Court of Canada's constitutionality ruling on March 25th, the Canadian federal government has a strengthened mandate to price carbon pollution across the country. So how has the outlook for jobs in the energy sector and new technologies changed? What has stayed the same? What roles will government and industry play to shepherd us through the energy transition? Listen on to find out. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 14. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as Adrian said, I'm joined by my usual webinar co-host, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and David Keith from Treaty 7 Land. We're very honored to be doing our second ever in-conference recording at the Calgary Climate Symposium. And what a great symposium lineup over the next couple days. I was very pleased to catch Bruce Laurie for the opening keynote. So today, 6 months ago, Sarah, David, and we published an op-ed in the Globe and Mail that really touched a nerve. Our guiding question was, our new federal finance minister, she was new at the time, Chrystia Freeland, wants to build back better. And as Albertans, we want to build Alberta back better. So what does this mean for Alberta oil? And by touching a nerve, we got 860 comments on it, partly admittedly, because of a clickbaity title, but not chosen by us, by the way, but also because people really care about the topic. So in the 7 months since that op-ed ran, of course, lots has happened on the energy and climate front. We have a new U.S. president with a $2 trillion climate plan. Canada has a new climate plan with an eye-grabbing carbon price schedule. The price of Canadian crude oil has shot up. And as of today, going back to that carbon price schedule, we have a strengthened federal mandate to price carbon pollution across the country. Some things haven't changed. We're still waiting for a federal budget to show the numbers behind Build Back Better, but at least now we have a date for it, Monday, April 19th. So today on our show, we're going to revisit themes in that op-ed, and we're going to unpack what it means for Calgarians and Albertans. And to do that, we're going to first, amongst the three of us, discuss 3 questions to do with the future of jobs in oil and gas, the future of other sectors, and of course, the perennial question, what is the role for government to help Alberta build back better? So then we'll get to audience questions. And to do that, you're going to ask your questions, please, using Microsoft Teams Q&A function. Okay, enough of a preamble or a rambling preamble from me. Let's get right to it. So our first question that we're going to tackle, revisiting our crystal balls from 7 months ago, channeling our inner Nostradamuses. What does the future of jobs in the traditional oil and gas parts of the energy sector in Calgary look like? And Sarah, I'm going to turn to you, please, to kick us off.
All right. So I dusted off my crystal ball, and it's, I think things are looking like they're progressing in a direction that we saw 6 months ago when we were talking about this, but if anything, accelerating. And so I think when I think about the future of demand for oil from Alberta, looking at where the demand for oil from the US is going to go, as well as some of the recent announcements coming from places like China and India around their own net zero goals, I think we see a world that is really accelerating in its transition towards electrification, certainly of, light light and mid-duty transportation, that being one of the major demand sources for oil. So I think we're going to see, the future really progressing in terms of first, the demand growth stopping. And you've seen just in recent days, folks from a wide range of the IEA, as well as a number of the large energy companies, international energy companies, really saying, peak oil may be in our rear view mirror. And so that obviously is going to impact what the oil sector looks like in Alberta and what jobs look like in Calgary. Now, as we often hear from people, it's also true that we're not going to stop using oil overnight, and that we have, a number of projects within the province that will, likely continue to produce oil for some time. So I think that there will still be that component of the jobs, but it will be much more focused really on managing that production and much less on the growth, and that obviously has some pretty strong implications. The other trend that I wanted to point out was one of really focused on cost cutting within the industry, and you've seen that the challenging news around some of the consolidations and resulting job losses that have happened over the past few months in Calgary, I think is something that's going to continue, which is as oil companies are looking to, tell a compelling story to investors around why it makes sense to stay invested in their companies. It seems that the one they're settling on is one of, low costs and cash flow that's going to enable them to bring back those dividends. And that again, has some implications for the jobs within Calgary. So, honestly, on the whole, I don't feel like it's a super rosy story for the future of jobs within the province and within Calgary. We may see a bit of that automation, lead to some additional employment opportunities there, but I'm kind of pessimistic about building back jobs in that sector.
All right, thanks, Sarah. David, not a rosy story. Peak oil is in our rearview mirror. We're not going to stop using oil overnight. Managing production, consolidation, loss of jobs. Let's hear what you think. What does the future look like in the oil and gas sector?
I'm not a Nostradamus, but I'll do my best. I'll talk about what I think the key forces are, and then say why I think it's particularly harsh for Calgary, which, to be clear, is a place I love. My daughter lives. I've got long roots there. So I think oil and gas prices are going to head down. That's not to say that they couldn't shoot up because of some Middle Eastern conflict, but I think they're going to head down for three big reasons. One is the global spread of climate policy. It's not going to happen as fast as I would want, as fast as many Greens would want, but it's happening. The second one is EVs, which are partly driven by climate policy, but partly driven that some EVs for short duty are actually getting to be better than gasoline vehicles, and people want them even without policy. And the third is tight oil. Tight oil is getting easier, and I think that's kind of a fundamental. The technology for it will spread globally, and all those things mean that the future for oil prices seems like it's down. I think oil prices will go down faster than gas prices because there are places where we will really want gas for a very long time as part of how we manage intermittency and manage electricity. So to be clear, we are going to make oil for a long time. If I had to guess, I would guess there'll still be production of over 1 million barrels a day here in 2050. So I think it'll happen for a long time. But the point is, it's going to be a descending trend. And that means, this is what's key. It means that the businesses will be focused on just operations and on squeezing every penny out of operations. And it means that there will be very little in the way of major new capital investment or engineering. And if you ask what has really driven the amazing boom in downtown Calgary that's brought in arts and culture and restaurants and what have you, it's been the high value jobs that are in finance and the big engineering firms doing the big build out. And I think those jobs are basically done. I don't think they're coming back under any plausible scenario. And I don't think some of the things that people have talked about that are kind of band-aids of doing a little bit of extra CCS or imagining we're going to somehow be exporting hydrogen using more or less the same technologies. I think it's very little chance that those supply jobs and value added and anything like that. One last comment to really sort of drive home how bad the situation is. And I don't say this with pleasure. I live here. This is going to be really hard for people in my family. But I think it's important to be real about where we're at. So oil and gas may only be of order 20%, depending on how you measure it, of the Alberta economy. but its impact as it goes down is larger because it is a value added that adds to the export value, which is in what turn in a balanced economy pays for the imports that we need for the rest of the Alberta economy. And so we can think about different measures of that, but the bottom line is a kind of decline in oil and gas net economic revenue of order 50% over a decade or two will really have a profound effect on the province's economy. And I think we need to really begin to be honest about where we are and think strategically about where we go next.
Great. Okay. Well, let me offer a few thoughts and then we'll get to our second question. I mean, maybe at the risk of sounding contrarian, I think things are actually going to get better in the short term. Now, to be clear, we're coming from a bad place for Alberta and for Calgary. We agree that oil's not going away. We're going to need 50 million barrels a day of new oil to replace existing reserves. Big government spending, let's face it, is going to boost oil demand for late 2021 and into 2022. And I wouldn't be surprised in the short term if it actually feels like it's back to normal. And already we're seeing news reports of a shortage of high-skilled workers in certain sectors like oil field services. It was just on the CBC this morning, and no surprise, unfortunately, I've had many people leave the province in the last 5 years. Where I agree is beyond 2022, it's going to get tougher. And yes, climate policies, EVs, the looming national and regional bans on internal combustion engines, that's going to depress fuel consumption, especially for passenger vehicles. I think larger vehicles, our trucks, our planes, our ships, oil will be slower, or fuel consumption will be slower, depression of fuel consumption. But then other fuels and potentially hydrogen is going to gradually depress fuel consumption there as well. But for me, where are the jobs going to be? The jobs are going to be in three areas. One, I think it's going to be oil and gas, advanced tech. It's companies, they're going to have to move from this high carbon, high cost quadrant to a low carbon, low cost quadrant. And to do that, they're going to have to be leaner and greener. On the lean side, it used to be you'd have 6 burly guys, and just to put a gender to it, with big biceps who would work these rigs. And even pre-pandemic, that had moved from 3 burly people and 1 SAT or NAT trained technician to do the same job. So, Sarah, to your point, I think we're going to see higher levels of AI, higher levels of automation, remote operations, remote sensing, minimizing product losses, minimizing methane, which is a good thing. And all of that is going to require high-tech people, but overall fewer jobs. I think we all agree that the oil sands will continue to be cash cows. The Suncors and the CNRLs have clearly figured out how to make money, how to produce cheaply and keep on world markets. Those are going to be good cash flow generating machines. The jobs will stay there. And lastly, I'd say petrochemicals. They're not going away soon. They're widely used in all sorts of consumer goods, industry, healthcare. And I think that side of demand for oil on the petrochemical side will be strong. But now let's go to something I think we all agree upon, and that is imagining a future where there are fewer jobs. So if there are fewer jobs, and especially, David, to your point, high-paying jobs in the oil and gas sector, what are other areas that we're bullish on? What other areas of the Alberta economy do we think will pick up the slack? And the follow-on question is, what skills and competencies can a city like Calgary leverage to build those other areas? So, David, let's go to you first.
I don't know the answer, but I start with what we do have. So Calgary specifically and Alberta have the youngest population in Canada, very educated, high skilled, both for high trade skills and high kind of secondary educational skills, and a business climate that really has worked well, particularly these big engineering firms that have really world-class skills in engineering big projects. And I think we need to think about that skill set that Calgary has and that the province has, and think about how to build on it. And I think that might be some common. And I think the mistake is to assume that the natural answer is something else in energy. It may be, but it may not be. It's not clear that just because this energy business is going down, that we will naturally be winners in some new clean energy business. Maybe, maybe not. And I think that's the key to me thing to be clear about, is to start with an honest assessment of like a SWOT analysis. What our skills are, what the threats are, what the opportunities are. And it could be that some of it is light manufacturing, could be some of it is engineering, engineering provided as a service to some of the places where engineers are not very expensive, like Silicon Valley. There's a range of different jobs, but I don't think it's necessarily clean energy.
All right, Sarah. So your SWOT analysis, what does it tell you in terms of the sectors that can pick up some of the slack if they can, and the skills and competencies that we need?
Yeah, so I would start off the top actually with just a broader point that, that as we said, right, this is going to be challenging. And I think none of us are happy about this, right? We all live here and we want to see the city be prosperous. I think the reason that I'm slightly less pessimistic than, the first question might imply is that part of the reason that Alberta and Calgary, has not diversified over the years is that it was very hard for anything else to compete with oil and gas, right? And so, I've done some research on this specifically within geothermal, where, there's obviously a lot of overlaps, but I think it's true for many other industries as well. And what you see is that as during boom times when oil prices rise, then investments into other industries decline. And that's really, fundamentally a labor supply, a investment capital supply question. And so I don't think that we should look at where Alberta is today and say, well, we haven't diversified so much. We have some, but we haven't diversified so much in the past. Therefore, we're not going to be able to because we don't know how to. I think there's a certain interpretation of it as, not only have we not maybe needed to, but we actually have been prevented from doing so previously by, the structure of our economy. So that's sort of maybe an overarching thought about, our likelihood of success here. I definitely agree with David around we need to think about the skills that we have and not tie ourselves to specific sectors, especially because when we think about the energy transition writ large beyond our borders, the fact that certain types of energy are going to be substituted by other types, it doesn't mean that the value chains for those energy systems will remain the same, right? So obviously right now there's a huge opportunity within the oil value chain to extract extract a lot of value if you're the ones extracting the oil. That doesn't necessarily mean that, if we start to use more and more renewable energy, that the owners of the renewable energy projects themselves will be the ones who are making, the similar profits. They'll make some profits. That's clearly a good business to be in. But I think we need to be really careful in sort of applying what we know about a specific value chain to a new one. So that's another kind of general point. And then I'll try to come and answer your question. Aside from the skills that David mentioned around, large capital projects, there's a couple other things that I would point to in our SWOT analysis. And one is, what are the other resources that we have as a province because of, the money that came in from oil and gas? And so, obviously what we don't have, and people like to bemoan, is a big bank account, like Norway. But we did build some pretty impressive institutions, right? So we invested some of that money into things like our building infrastructure around our universities and around some of our healthcare facilities and things like that. So in addition to looking at what are the skills that we have in the people, it's a question of what are those resources that we have that can also be redeployed. And one area that I'm, I guess, kind of bullish on is around this metals and minerals. So as we transition to a world that's using more renewable energy and less fossil energy, it's still going to be a world that needs resources, and it needs resources like lithium and rare earths and others. And I think Canada and Alberta and Calgary in particular has a real opportunity there because, extracting resources is large capital projects. It takes engineering skills, all those things that we know. And places like the US are really, I think, starting to confront the fact right now that they are going to need a lot more of these resources in a short time. And, I know people like to talk about how it's hard to build new projects in Canada, but I was speaking with some folks in the US the other day who were saying, you can get a mine and start production of minerals so much faster in Canada than you can in the US. So, I think that those kinds of areas, which are, in my mind, they're still, I guess I'm counteracting myself because they're still in the energy space, but a very different form of energy. And that is a little bit of the, are we going to be the Kodaks who, sort of half-heartedly goes for the digital camera and doesn't make it? Or are we going to be the Fujis who says, well, I was in cameras, but really what I know is, making film and these chemicals. And so what else can I do with that technology?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this diversification question, to your point, Sarah, we've had report after report. I remember the Emerson report from 2011, which was the latest at that time, blue ribbon panel exercise to come up with a grand diversification plan for Alberta. It landed at the wrong time, and that the oil and gas economy was doing well. It got put on a shelf. And that has happened throughout Alberta's history. I mean, for me, if I say what sectors could pick up the slack, I guess I'm kind of closer to David in that I don't know. I mean, we've got a range of options that could work for Alberta. People talk about healthcare, and I did a call round actually on this late last year. Healthcare, clean tech, rare earth metals, to your point, Sarah, chemicals, manufacturing, transport, lots in ag tech, agri-food, but there's no one sector that anyone points to and says definitively that this is the sector that is going to absorb those high-paying jobs that have been so critical to Alberta's economic prosperity over decades. So I think in the short term, we're going to have to take a let many flowers bloom approach, but then we may find out at the end of that we've got little fits and starts in sectors, but nothing with the absorption capacity that the energy sector has provided. So what can the energy sector do? I mean, I'm still bullish, frankly, on the energy sector. Like in a world that's transitioning, working for Uber or Tesla may sound sexy and very transition-y, but if you want to change the world, and I think this gets to your point, David, around engineering firms and EPCs and big oil and gas majors, you'll have more opportunity with major established energy firms. They've got huge R&D budgets. They've got engineering capabilities. They're already working on new fuel products, integrated energy solutions that combine renewables with natural gas, with energy storage. I think there's a huge future potentially for these firms and things like energy trading, wholesaling, retailing as the world electrifies mobility and heat, connecting customers through apps. And if you think about it, Suncor and Petro-Canada and the Shells and the retail outlets already right now, they have daily customer levels that would make the average burger chain super envious. And it's a way of how do they connect to those customers on things beyond just fuel products and potato chips and chocolate bars. Now, I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, folks. I want to move us along so we have lots of time for your Q&A. So we're now back to the perennial question, and the three of us have talked about this ad nauseum because we have to, between ourselves and our guests. What is the role of government? And not just the federal government, lots of attention on the feds today because of their national carbon price and the Supreme Court ruling, but at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels to help Alberta to build back better. What policies should be pursued and which are the ones that are stinkers that we should avoid? So Sarah, let's go to you first.
So I have all my favorite policies, I guess, but it's really, I think, a basket of policies. And we need to be really clear, I think, around where we're trying to reduce emissions because we have a climate goal for the province or the country or the city, and where we're trying to, encourage economic development. And there's obviously, a huge amount of overlap between those two things, in sort of obvious ways and less so. But sometimes I think they do end up getting mixed. And so, for example, sometimes we talk a lot about how much effort we should be putting into reducing emissions from the oil and gas sector itself, right? And that's one where I think the government policy to do that really is a carbon price. So, right, you say you put a price on carbon, and then you should rely to a large extent on the companies themselves to deploy technologies to reduce emissions, because the limited runway means that we only have so much time to really develop new technologies and get them deployed, and it's really about the upstream piece of the emissions. And so we could clean that up in Canada, but that's not going to kind of get us most of the way where we need to go. I think that the other thing that is really important for governments at all levels, again, to do is to acknowledge that there is a role for government in new industries, right? And there was a very strong role that the provincial government played in funding the development of the in situ oil sands production technology at the time through AOSTRA. So, this myth that kind of you stand back and let the market, create these new industries without government involvement, I think is not, it's not borne out. But at the same time, there's good and bad ways, and that you can spend a lot of money chasing industries without getting much done there. So I think that part of that, and where I think we sometimes are a little bit shy within Canada, is that we do need to pick some sectors to invest in, and governments do need to make some more direct investments, not just things like tax breaks, or trying to kind of create a space for everybody, but actually being a little bit more bold and going after some areas that fit with those skills that we talked about.
So Sarah, I just want to be clear on what you're saying, because I think we'd agree governments can invest in R&D when the private sector won't, and then we should have the private sector come in when there's a path to profitability. But you're weighing in on a question, the other perennial question that splits the room down the middle: should governments pick winners and losers? And in Alberta's case, should governments be picking winners and invest in those winners?
Yes, so I think governments should be picking winners, and governments do pick winners, and governments always have picked winners, even those that claim, the US is famous for this idea of, we don't pick winners, but they have one of the biggest industrial policy states, in the world. So governments pick winners, and I think we need to pick winners that are aligned with, what are the products and services that the world is going to need going forward, and what do we have to offer as a city and as a province.
Great. Okay. David, love to get your question on just generally your answers, sorry, on the role of government. And if you can, weigh in. Should government be picking winners and losers? I mean, you started a clean tech company with a specific technology that benefited from early stage government support.
Yes, but not in Alberta, which is why we went to BC. Yeah. But pretty much disdain and laughter in Alberta. But I want to talk about universities. So universities obviously just educate people. It's an essential thing governments do in democracies, but they do more than that. They serve as hubs, or can serve as hubs, that bring in new ideas, that connect up to the kind of global cutting edge of innovation and allow us to figure out what's next. So part of my answer is we don't know exactly what's next, but having a really great university sector is beyond just the simple business of educating undergraduates, which is super important. It can connect us to a larger world and tell us what's going on. And I think Alberta is due for a big reform in universities. So I was a professor at University of Calgary in a time where U of C and U of A were fighting over energy centers. And we had these little divided things, with each of the two of them having, competing over individual professors or moving people back and forth, and both of them claiming to be world-class universities and full-service universities. Let me be honest. A, there are some fantastic people in both universities. There's lots of talent here, and it's actually pretty well funded. B, the idea that we can have two world-class universities is a joke. The reality is this is a province of only 4.5 million people, or whatever it is. There are cities with much bigger populations. We need to think seriously about playing to win. And to me, playing to win means finding a way perhaps to go back to calling it all University of Alberta North and South, and really starting to get serious about saying that we're going to specialize the two. So maybe we have one econ department in one place and one mech E department in the other place. We've shown that remote teaching can work really well. We can't pretend that everybody can have everything. And if we want to have a university with the money we've got that really wins, we need to think differently.
Yeah, okay, I want to weigh in, but I also want to respect that this cuts close to home for Professor Sarah Hastings-Syvid. So quick response on David's suggestions around universities.
Yeah, so I mean, the Alberta, Calgary, Edmonton question, I would argue that we do have enough space in the province for two world-leading universities. I think it's true that, they shouldn't be directly competing within the same areas. And I would question, how many more we need overall. But I think that they bring, different things to the table. And I think in particular for Calgary, it's quite important to really preserve that, strong, independent university that was really a big part of what the city got as an investment return from the oil and gas revenues that came. So I think it's something we should be supporting going forward.
Okay, great.
I'm totally agreeing with that. I'm just saying do some rationalization.
Okay, let me weigh in. So on the government question, yes, I think public money needs to be targeted in a way to achieve multiple policy objectives. That's hard. We're going to see on April 19th how the feds do it. Yes, get government money in early stage R&D until companies have that path of profitability. And yes, let carbon pricing and regulations like the Clean Fuel Standard, frankly, be drivers of the shift. And as we argued in our op-ed, let's stay away from those moonshot public investments. I don't think that's a wise use of public money. I will say, in terms of a winner, I remain bullish on CCS or CCUS and direct air capture. I think all credible pathways to net zero flow through those technologies, as Bruce Laurie talked about earlier. And I think Canada does pretty well globally in terms of creating IP and patents and projects, but we really need to follow the lead of the US. The US has found the right policy recipe, and that includes an investment tax credit or a production tax credit for CCS projects. And I think the federal budget should do the same. Last thing is say, we just have to acknowledge that like a battle, we might all go in, but not everyone comes out. On the outside of this pandemic, when things recover, not all companies will be coming out the other side. And it's certainly not the job of government to ensure that everyone survives. That's an unfortunate reality. It's part of capitalism. All right, let's get to Q&A here. Our first question, we're going to go, sorry, I'm looking for it here, to Dan. Dan has a question about cleaning up oil operations. So given that oil isn't going away, does it make sense to invest capital to clean up oil operations? Or would that capital be better deployed in technology that avoids using the oil in the first place, like electrification? David, Sarah, one of you want to jump in on that one?
I have a simple, blunt answer. I don't think it makes sense to spend a lot of money to clean up existing oil operation because it won't change our economic future. It won't make people want to buy the oil. I think we need to focus on things that manage our environmental problems or things that make jobs to the future.
Yeah, but David, I want to press you on that because, we talked a few times about methane. So we need any oil and gas producing jurisdiction in the world to reduce methane. It's a huge short-term climate forcer. It's an economic opportunity. Alberta has a lead on that because Alberta was the first jurisdiction that put in place a serious methane reduction target. There's lots of labor and capital that's been mobilized around that. Why wouldn't we make that one of those niches that we can then export to the rest of the world and help them clean up their oil and gas operations?
So first of all, I don't think it's huge. Methane has only a 10-year lifetime. If you look over long-term climate risk, it's a pretty small contribution to long-term climate risk. Methane in the atmosphere is pretty stable. It's going up a little bit, but it just objectively isn't a top-level problem. And this is a problem where if you're talking about methane leakage, it's being investigated by the oil and gas industry around the world. So unless there's a particular place where Canada's got an amazing niche, but largely the methane problem is going to clean itself up as production goes down. And it's not what drives climate change. I mean, just no scientist says that. It isn't.
I think it's also a question though of the public versus private, right? And who's spending what. So, should there be rules around methane emissions? Should methane have, an effective carbon price that is equivalent to the carbon price? Yes, for sure. And then if there are opportunities to do that, that should be pursued by the companies that are, that are invested in production. I think that's no question. But, government money, to me, there has to be that justification of, what is the reason that you need this investment, aside from just somebody wants to, pay less for something. And I don't think it meets the bar in the methane case.
Certainly anything. I mean, if you look at LNG Canada, and lots of people talk about LNG Canada and Canadian exports of LNG going to help solve the world's climate problem by displacing coal-fired electricity in China. Now, the energy economics there, when you do the math, everything has to go right for that to work. But there are some credible analyses to show, yes, there's an environmental gain, provided though we're going hard on the upstream side and going after methane. And the one thing about methane, it is a very cheap ton to go after, very cheap one. Okay.
I think maybe we don't distinguish support for R&D in general and support and sectoral support. So to be clear, I think government should have policy. So if some Calgary entrepreneur figures out a super high value added way to deal with methane that's going to be like world beating and build a business, of course there should be ways government should support them, like any business that can prove that. But the question is, does it make sense sectorally to say this is something where overall there's likely to be a large scale business and sort of sector based in Canada or Alberta? And I'm more skeptical about that.
Okay. Let's get to another question. We've got Robert's question. On Sarah's Minerals point, does the pushback we've seen on coal mining in Alberta, and I think we're talking around sort of Crow's Nest Pass area and the rollback of the Lougheed era restrictions, signal that mineral development could be difficult in Alberta too? Would it be different if the minerals weren't in the Rockies or if they weren't coal? So, Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it brings up this point. We've talked about it before, I think, but there's often this sort of very simplistic view of like, well, okay, you want to stop using oil and you're going to use lithium instead, but lithium can also be bad for the environment. Therefore, that's also bad and we shouldn't do that. And there is, it's a complex issue. So it's certainly true that any kind of resource production has impacts on, air, land, water, biodiversity, carbon. And then the question is, what's the value of what you're taking out and what do you do to minimize those impacts? And so I do see a big difference between, mining for coal in the Rockies and mining for lithium, in a different region. And that's both because of the resource itself. So, the amount of coal that you need to, achieve the kind of same amount of work compared to lithium. It's not a great example because you're using them in sort of different ways, but essentially there's a lot more energy value that you get out of the lithium. It's clearly also, where the demand is going as well. I think there's certainly some concern around coal mining in the Rockies in terms of, how long is this even going to be an economic opportunity as the world moves away from coal. But it's undeniable that we also need to make sure that as we're producing these new resources, that we're doing so in ways that are environmentally responsible and that we're thinking, better upfront about liabilities at the end of the lifetime of mines than we have in the past. So, I think this is a real opportunity for Canada. I think there is the potential for, Alberta to credibly present itself as a preferred producer of these materials, but it's not you have to do the hard work of having the right regulations and controls that don't turn it into another liability problem.
Great. Yeah, just a quick thought. So when we're mining for met coal, we got to think of where this met coal is going. A lot of it is going to fire blast furnaces in the steel industry. And let's face it, the steel industry, in many ways, and in Canada at least, has had a free pass compared to, folks in the oil and gas sectors. Why do we have such a disproportionate disproportionate gaze upon us? They've got a point. If you look at cement and steel and mining, they have big environmental footprints. Combined steel and cement alone, more than 10% of Canada's industrial emissions. And to date, the companies have largely been left to their own devices, and that many have done some admirable things. But increasingly, we're going to see old blast furnaces being switched out for new capital stock, and those new capital stock with direct reduced iron furnaces or electric arc furnaces won't have the same need for met coal. And that's going to happen slowly globally as well. So the difference is what we're unearthing there will have less and less of an end use. Whereas I think, Sarah, as you've talked about, the rare earth metals will have an increasing demand and in part driven by EVs.
Well said, both of you.
All right. Next question. When do you anticipate electricity will be able to replace natural gas for the heating of our homes? David, Sarah. David, you want to weigh in?
Well, yeah, I'd like to weigh in since I just drilled geothermal wells on my house site in Canmore last week.
Did you drill them yourself, David?
I did not drill them. You're right. I, the bloated plutocrat, paid cash for somebody else to come, the geothermal drill them. The actual direct well drilling cost is less than 10 grand. And, for a kind of wealthy person's house, that's not a big deal. And so our house will have no natural gas connection, which feels kind of great. But I think when you think about how to apply this more generally, it is absolutely doable and doable at costs that are cheaper than what I did in my house. And there are two keys to it. One is doing it at a block by block level or a district heating level. There's a lot of reason to believe that that is fundamentally cheaper and more efficient, more capital efficient. And I think if we want to decarbonize and you're changing existing housing stock or building new, that's a great way to do it. And the other way is there's some really interesting startups, including one really clever one in the Northeast that is using a bunch of kind of simple, obvious internet stuff to reduce a bunch of the transaction costs. So if I think about the wells that just got drilled here, there were a bunch of people, my contractor, the lead of this company, who all came and drove out and sat and talked and decided on our property. And none of that really needed to happen. He could have done it more efficiently where you lined it all up beforehand and chose it over a cell phone. And there's a company doing that now. So I think there really is a very clear pathway to efficiently electrify home heating and get rid of gas.
Great. I feel like, David, this is our ongoing geothermal debate at the residential level. So I hear you on the second point. There's all sorts of economies of scale, efficiencies that can be had. But on the first point, let's face it, Albertans are fierce individualists. And to order to get that block level cooperation happening, you're pretty much talking about new build. So what do we do with the existing stock, and how do you convince your whole block of neighbors to switch out at the same time?
Yeah, and how do you convince people to share roads or sewers or people are fierce individualists, but they seem to like to not just go shit in the street, and they seem to like.
Well, we've been doing that for 200 years.
Yeah, but I mean, we live in a connected society, and the answer is we make collective decisions. People talk about being individualists, but come on, we don't really want to do our own policing or our own removing our waste.
Got you. Right.
And it's interesting, all the things that you're mentioning. Of course, I'm thinking about how we're in a City of Calgary webinar, and so I can't help but point out that a lot of these are really municipal level issues, right? And also, I mean, the building codes, of course, has a provincial piece, but there's also municipal as well. And so I think there's also there's a lot of opportunity in addition to the geothermal home heating. It's a little bit warmer here in Calgary than where you are, David. So heat pumps, I think, are a really interesting option. There's some questions about what you do for that one cold week when it gets down really to minus 30 and you're pretty much just using it as a resistive heater. But there's, I think it's a great example of where there can be a role for government to overcome a barrier that's around education. So for example, we see a lot more homes that are installing air conditioners as the summers are getting hotter in Calgary. And that's not just anecdotal. So Professor Blake Schaefer has done some nice analysis on the growth there. And an air conditioner and a heat pump are not that far apart. And a heat pump, through the magic of basically moving heat around is hard, means that you're essentially able to get a higher efficiency out of the electricity to heat your home with a heat pump than you are a direct air heat pump that you are with a resistive heater.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm going to accuse both of you of happy talk, which is the wild accusation in energy versus climate. So first, I agree. Electrifying heat or doing something about how we heat buildings is really important. You look at net zero models; it's absolutely what we have to do. The panel for resilient recovery really focused in. Bruce talked about in this talk about changing out our building stock. It's just hard when you're competing with a bunch of capital stock that's long been sunk in. I've got a high efficiency furnace, but I put that high efficiency furnace in a couple of years ago. You'd have to really convince me with compelling economics to switch that out anytime soon. What I want to do is make the natural gas that we combust in my high efficiency furnace cleaner. And I think there are a bunch of ways that we can do that. And I think on the pathway to net zero, that will be one of the last things to go, is how we heat our buildings.
So I think you don't disagree, right? But it's like, let's do both at the same time. So let's figure out how to reduce the methane upstream from the gas that you're using. But when your neighbor goes to replace their furnace or put in an air conditioner, exactly because that capital stock is going to be around for a long time, let's start getting those new purchase decisions right now. And so that's where, it becomes, we kind of have to walk and chew gum if we're really going to address climate at the speed that we need to. And so that means, using those tools at the municipal government level to make sure that people, everybody doesn't have to go and research and become a heat pump expert in order to know what they should install. But there's an easy way to, find the people that are going to do that and kind of give you the capital equipment that's going to be good for the next 30 years.
What she said, and point to you, Ed, I agree. I think capital stock in buildings is very slow, and I don't expect a quick turnover to electrification. Complete agreement. But I do think we do both.
Okay. Now, we don't have much time left, so I want to get like 30-second answers from both of you. I want to take advantage of you being university professors. You're constantly teaching and mentoring young people. We've got a question. If someone wants to be prepared for a career in Alberta and a career in the clean economy, what do you recommend that they study in university? And 30 seconds or less, please.
Practical engineering, management, quantitative social sciences, stuff that you can apply directly. I don't think there's any single answer.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a social technical system. I mean, David and I are both physicists by training, so maybe you should study physics. But I think most of all, people should, try to get an education that exposes them both to some of those technical components, but I think not just that. Think about really, we talked about how systems are hard to change, and so what are the skills that you need to be a part of changing those systems going forward? Okay,
and I want to understand in Alberta, that's all doable. We've got the institutions for it, but the debate we're talking about the right allocation.
No, I think we don't know. I think we don't have institutions. So again, there's fantastic people at both those universities, but the institutions really don't do a very good job in this regard. And I really see that going back and forth between where I say, forget Harvard, where I was at Carnegie Mellon and here. Our institutions could be a lot better with the money we have. And we as citizens should demand them to be better because that's a key part of driving things.
And I think they are. So I gotta come back with the U of C defense, but I think that some of the new direction, right, around increasing interest in transdisciplinary scholarship, which I think is something that Carnegie Mellon does very well, as focusing on a broader within energy space, but still focused, I think is going in that right direction. So I'm bullish on where things are going.
Agreed, it's going in the right direction, but part of the lesson from CMU is kill things. So don't just add new things. CMU was ruthless about killing things. And that's part of the reason it was so good. It made actual decisions. Didn't just kind of always say, well, there's some of A and some of B. It's like, no, we're going to kill A.
All right. And I'm going to kill this show. I'm getting the virtual hook to wrap up. So thanks to you both. And a reminder that this episode is going to be available on energyversusclimate.com. Be available using all your favorite podcasters on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. Our next episode is April 8th, Decarbonizing Electrifying Transportation with Professor Amy Myers-Jaffe of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Amy is a world-leading expert in this field. You won't want to miss it. We're super excited about having Amy on the show. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Thanks to the City of Calgary for having us today. Thanks to Mika McFarland for his terrific day of webinar support, as always. And thanks to our very patient producer, Eva Voinigescu. All right. Enjoy the rest of the symposium, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keefe, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Mika McFarland provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.